Voilà. Merci.
So thank you very much for the invitation. And like with Jules, I was invited, and Theo proposed the title. So he proposed the use and evaluation of interactive machine learning. So I didn't have time to respond quickly at the beginning, and I thought about it, and then I said, well, not a bad idea. So I managed to make some slides. My research is mostly in visualization, and particularly in something called visual analytics. So for those of you who are not familiar with visual analytics, it's a subfield of visualization which is interested in combining visualization, interactive visualization, and analysis methods and algorithms for the purpose of analyzing complex data sets. And I will give you some examples. So I work at INRAE, which is known to work for food, agriculture, the environment. So you might be asking a question, what is the link between visualization and INRAE? So to answer that question, INRAE actually produces lots of data. And this data has many characteristics. So I'm going to go very briefly about the types of data that we tend to deal with, or our domain experts tend to produce. So this data set can be captured particularly at different scales. So the notion of scale is very important to our domain experts. So data could be collected at the product scale. A product could be, pizza, it could be cheese, it could be wine. These are the kind of objects of study that our domain experts are working on. It could be captured at the sector scale. So we could be talking about the wheat sector. So we will have data about wheat from the farm until what we call the fork, until the consumer stage. We could have data at the individual, the consumer state, so for example about their food habits, consumption habits, or the digestion, or we could have data at a very large scale, at the population scale. And another characteristics of the data that we are working with in INRAE is the dynamics. So this is typically data that captures or describes dynamic systems, so they change over time. And the time scale could really vary. It could be seconds, for example, when you have sensor data studying a fermentation process. It could be data captured at an hourly rate, such as for digestion, at a seasonal rate, or it could be over a long period of time, such as here on studying climate change. And then, of course, we have big data, we have sensors, we have high throughput computing, but we have what we call also sparse data. So our domain experts continue to work with sparse data. So if you have, you can imagine working on an Excel table, which is very typical for our domain experts. You have lots of columns, or features, and then you have very few rows, because experiments are actually quite costly and expensive. So you might have an experiment with 2 repetitions, and we still, even with sparse data, we still have domain experts who want to exploit this data and want to understand what's the main features of their biological system, and also make predictions. So I'm part of a department and unit at INRAE, based in Université Paris Saclay, which does modeling. Basically, there are 2 main teams. There is Solstice and EKINOCS. So notice the very carefully chosen names. So Solstice is mostly a team of statisticians. They do statistical modeling. And I am part of EKINOCS, which is more a data science team. So we have expertise in machine learning, in optimization, in knowledge integration, and also in visualization. So we have a beautiful campus with lots of space and all of that, but very hard to get access to, unfortunately. So if I have to summarize the main work of my team, it's around models. So they create models, typically machine learning models. And they go through a process, if I can summarize it very briefly, it's designing the model, tuning some parameters, and then trying to do some sort of exploration, like typically like some sensitivity analysis. So this is a very naive, very explanation of what machine learning is for my team, given that I am from the visualization domain. My work within the EKINOCS team is about making the human at the center of the modeling team at the different stages. In particular, I've been working in close collaboration with a variety of user groups. So I work with domain experts, could be biologists, agronomists, with model developers, so machine learning, optimization specialists, and also with decision makers, local authorities, etc. in some projects. And the work I'll be reporting to you today is mostly focused on what I've done in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, working with domain experts when they try to explore complex data sets and model simulations. And of course, given that Theo gave me the title, I have to talk about evaluation. So I'll do that as well. So the approach is what we call interactive visual machine learning. So I've added the visual because that's my expertise. And the purpose or the goal of IVML, or interactive visual machine learning, and sorry for a new acronym, is the purpose is to support the collaboration between the humans and the machine, or the machine learning, or the algorithms, for the purpose of achieving a particular task. So the task could be, these are IVML systems from the literature, clustering documents. It could be to label data sets, or to learn some sort of distance function, or even just for training a model. And so the purpose is to support this collaboration, but using an interactive visual interface. So you might be asking a question, which is why the IVML approach, in contrast to just an automatic approach that my team is usually doing. So in our case, especially for INRAE, the IVML, or the interactive approach to machine learning, is very, very advantageous for many reasons. And one of the top reasons is this idea of expertise. We have valuable expertise at INRAE, on the different biological processes that sometimes are hard to model in mathematical or computational models, having computational models. And they sit as tacit knowledge in people's head. So having an interactive approach, maybe we can make the most of this expertise. This interactive approach may help resolve some uncertainties as a result of automatic learning due to errors and biases. And finally, our intuition is that if we involve domain experts in the modeling process, we might actually foster more trust in those models and maybe the modeling process. And I think there's been work on that to prove that this is correct to a certain extent. So over the last few years, I've been involved in the development and evaluation of a couple of IVML systems. One of them is called Videogram, and the other one is called AgroParisTech. So these are clearly identified needs in that domain experts came to us with the problem of saying we want to be able to create, to do what they call interactive multi-scale modeling, which I will explain shortly, and they wanted tools that are interactive to explore data. So Videogram, which is the work of two PhD students, Thomas Chabin and Marc Barnabé, they worked on developing this tool, which is for interactive multi-scale modeling, so taking this notion of scale. And so the idea is to create graphical models. So the system, the biological system that they're trying to model here is lactic bacteria under some sort of conditions, like dry freezing. And so what Videogram does, it proposes graph-based models. How does it do that? First of all, the system is described as a set of variables, constraints, and classes. And the classes typically describe different scales. For example, here we have the genetic scale, we could have the cell scale, and population scale. So after we defined these variables and the classes and the constraints, the system proposes some local models. The local models are basically mathematical functions that like input and output parameters. Then we have an expert evaluate the proposed mathematical functions. So they decide that this, for example, equation is pertinent to them, makes sense, or it doesn't. So they decide to keep it or not. Of course, there is some sort of automatic evaluation, which uses a complexity fitness trade-off. So complexity, how much it fits the available data, the experimental data. And the complexity, it's about how complex is the proposed formula. Then we have an interactive evolutionary algorithm to generate a global model, taking in consideration this trade-off between subjective expert evaluation, whether they prefer or they think this is a pertinent function, and also the automatic evaluation demonstrated by the complexity inputs. The second IVML system is called AgroParisTech, and this one is for exploring multidimensional data sets. And this is the one I probably will describe it in a little bit more detail than Videogram, because we built this a long time ago, and actually we've had a lot of use of this system in RAE. So I think I have more things to say about it, and we've done also lots of evaluations. What's interesting to note between the two systems is that they both use machine learning in a very large sense. They use optimization to guide user exploration of the search space. So for the first tool, the algorithm, where the interactive evolutionary algorithm guides the exploration of graphs, of mathematical functions. And then for the AgroParisTech, it guides the exploration of 2D projections of scatter plots. And I'll explain a little bit about how it does this in the next few slides. So, of course, I'll pick an example that's related to INRAE, biscuits. Hopefully you had a nice breakfast, so you're not hungry. So imagine you're an expert in biscuit making. We have actually such experts in INRAE. And so you will be collecting data about the biscuit making process. You probably have data about your oven, so the top heat of your oven, the bottom heat of your oven, the humidity of the oven, and then some parameters about your biscuits like the color, the height, and weight. Intuitively, you know there is some sort of relationship between the input parameters, the heat and humidity, and then the output parameters, which are the height, color of your biscuit. And so you might be doing some sort of simple visualization, a scatter plot matrix visualization, which typically shows all the bivariate combinations of data. And yeah, you might get some patterns, or you might not. But typically, what our domain experts are interested in is not to show one by one, like two-dimensional projections. They're interested to see the combined effect of a number of dimensions on, say, for example, the height or the weight of the color of the biscuit. And so what they wanted actually is a way to explore, or to generate first, and then to explore a huge set of combined dimensions. So the question that we're faced with is, how do you generate these combined dimensions, knowing that there is a multitude of ways of combining the input dimensions? And so our research question was, how do you explore such a huge space, given that it is completely impractical to do it manually, without some sort of guidance? And so in terms of guidance, we chose this, what we call evolutionary visual exploration. And so inspired by the process of evolution, by natural selection, we start with an initial data set. So imagine this is your biscuit data set with 5 or 6 dimensions. And then over time, we try to evolve to the projections that are interesting to the user. And it's all in the interesting. How do we evaluate what's interesting, what's pertinent to the user? And I will explain how in the next slide. We use interactive evolutionary algorithms to implement this. So I mentioned, guiding the user towards interesting areas of the search space. So this is managed by a fitness function, which evaluates the projections. So the fitness function has 3 components. It has one which is user assessment. So we did it very, very simply by allowing the user to evaluate certain projections. So they will give it a score from 1 to 5. Say this kind of scatter plot, I think it's not pertinent, I'll give it a 1, or very pertinent, I'll give it a 5. So that's the interactive component. And then we have a complexity component, which is about combined dimensions. We are favoring combined dimensions that are simpler to interpret. So we'll have less dimensions and maybe less nested. And then we have something which is a surrogate function, a substitution function. Because we are in data exploration context, and users are particularly interested in seeing patterns in the data, so linear distributions, maybe clumpy or outline distributions, we use Cognostics, which is a package by Wilkinson and Wills, which gives us the amount of visual pattern in the scatter plot. So it tells us, for example, how much outline patterns exist in the scatter plot or how much linear patterns exist. And whereas this term here is interactive and this one is automatically calculated, this particular one is learned. So over a number of user interactions, the system learns the type of patterns that interest the user. So it could be that they're more interested in a particular instance to find outliers, and then it tries to drive the exploration towards this area of the search space. So very quickly about the system that we implemented, which is actually based on an already existing system developed at IHMIA that didn't have the evolutionary part. So we have the scatter plot matrix. So in this particular case, we have 5 dimensions. And then we have the proposed space. So 1, 2, 3, 5, actually the combined dimensions that were proposed by the evolutionary algorithm. We have then a zoomed-in view to see, for example, this is a selected view, and this is the combined dimension that the system is proposing. The color, the background color, denotes how much the system thinks this view is pertinent to the user. So if it is darker, it means this is a signal for the user to say, check this out. It could be interesting for you. And as I mentioned, the user can evaluate certain cells and give feedback to the system in a very basic manner. Other user interactions are, since they have expertise, they might be actually able to, they might want to define the dimension they want to combine. It probably wouldn't make sense to combine color with heat, for example. So they would be able to inject the expertise to define a subset of the search space. And they could, of course, also input their own combined dimensions. They could actually have expertise. For example, we use this for wine recipes exploration. So we had experts who know about wine fermentation, and they were able to inject certain wine recipe with certain aromas and types of alcohols that they would like to explore. So they would actually input the components and the weights directly. So we kept this functionality because expertise can be injected directly. So yeah, when we designed Evrograph dies, we wanted it to be intuitive, so we didn't want any kind of prerequisites in terms of knowledge about regression or statistics. We wanted to be completely intuitive and interactive. So instead of also fitting the data to a predefined kind of pattern, we wanted to learn from user interactions the kind of patterns that they're interested in. We wanted it to be adaptable, so if the user changes their mind over time, so I'm no longer interested in linear patterns, I want to look at clumpy ones, then the system should be able to learn the new change of goals and adapt to it. And arguably, interactive evolution algorithms supposed to follow change of user goals. And then we wanted it to be flexible, so we can actually inject expertise directly. So did we succeed in doing that? And to answer that question, we need to do evaluations. So how did we do that? So given that there are many components to IVML systems, including the algorithm, the user interface, the visualizations, we thought we need to do evaluation to make sure for sanity check that the algorithm is behaving correctly, but also not neglect the user. We need to kind of also do some user-centered evaluations. So I'm going to go briefly about doing more like user-centered evaluations. So we had participants basically in studies. Of course, we did that as well. There are some certain evaluations done in the evolutionary computation to check sanity of the algorithm, that it is providing varied solution, that is conversion, etc. I'm not going to report on this here. Now I'm going to show you a quantitative user study that we did to try and evaluate a little bit our tool. So we wanted to know whether the Evrograph dice is able to steer the exploration to an interesting area of the search space, and whether the solutions were varied. So we worked with a basic synthetic data set, and we had to design a task, which is kind of a game task, very simple, but it allows us to study the system in a little bit more detail. So we had like a synthetic data set that had 5 dimensions, and between 2 dimensions, x1 and x2, or x0 and x1 in this case, we embedded a curvilinear dependency, and for the rest of the dimensions, we had noise. And so the user task was to use Evrograph dice in order to evolve a scatter plot where it's possible to separate these 2 clusters by straight line. So using the system to separate the 2 sets. And so these are 2 potentially valid solutions to the game task. So we have one where the system proposes a combined dimension that is simple, and then we have another combined dimension that is more complex, but they can equally solve the problem. So how did our participants do? So typically in HCI, we do have a small set of participants, so we do, that's not typical in HCI studies, we have 12 participants. And then to analyze the data, we looked at conversions, we looked at the scoring strategies, so how they used the slider to evaluate the cells, and looked at the visual patterns of what they were looking at in terms of scatter plots. So I'm going to go very quickly about the results. So we looked at conversion. So is the interactive evolutionary algorithm able to follow user ranking? So if the user is saying this scatter plot is very interesting to me, does the system follow? What's the difference between the rankings? So we have plots like this one comparing user evaluation with the system evaluation. And it seems that our system is following not exactly the ranking, because we don't have 5 given by the user and 5 given by the system, but it kind of follows the order of the predictions, especially when they, of course, for the successful sessions, because there were sessions where the task failed. And so we don't observe this pattern. So that's kind of reassuring for us. And then we looked at the user evaluation strategies. So we gave them a chance to give the system feedback between 1 to 5. And we were able to observe different evaluation strategies. So some users tried to use the whole range of evaluations from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And some maybe were not so bothered, or they had a reason to do that, and they used 1 and 5. Almost a way to really give a strong signal to the system, good and bad. So we had this kind of 2 strategies. But we didn't manage to see any link between evaluation strategy and the outcome of the exploration, or even the speed of conversions. Both strategies led to success in most cases. And of course, we analyzed what visual patterns were interested to the user. So these are the scattermostics. So these are the types of point distributions. Probably this is perhaps linear or some sort of point distribution. So we were able to see different user strategies. Well, the interesting finding here is that the more consistent users were in exploring the search space. For example, if they were focused on linear patterns over a long period of time, the system learns better, and of course, the convergence was quick. Maybe this is not surprising, but this is something we observed. So key findings from the evaluation is that users tend to take different search strategies and evaluation strategies, even for a very simple task as a game task that we saw earlier. We saw a link between user search strategy and the outcome of the exploration and speed of conversions, with consistency leading to successful outcome and quicker conversions. And then we didn't find a link between evaluation strategy and speed. So having said that, now that we did the evaluation with toy data sets, we know that real-world situations, the data is more complex, the tasks are more complex. We also cannot really expect users to give us consistent feedback all the time. And also in real life, we don't have a ground truth. We don't have the solutions, really. It tends to be exploratory. So what evaluation methods do we have to evaluate with real data sets? Well, in HCI, we have qualitative user studies. So we did that. We run the same study, but with experts in different domains, from medicine, from of course, agronomy and geography, etc., who came in with their own data sets and their own tasks, and they explored the data with infograph dice. So we gave them two particular tasks. We gave them one which is, can you explore the data to confirm existing findings, and then try and find something new. So by saying, try and confirm, we wanted to see whether they're able to actually use the system to confirm what they already knew, and whether they would be able to find what they already knew. I don't know how much time we have. So. And then find new insights. And we did a standard qualitative study methodology. In this case, we had 5 domain experts. Each session lasted 2.5 hours. So compare that with doing a toy data set where the task lasted 20 minutes. So they are very costly experiments, and this is probably why typically we find less number of people participating in these studies. So the kind of results we had are qualitative in nature, of course. So we were able to see that domain experts can indeed use successfully infograph dice to do certain things. They were able to generate new hypotheses that they didn't think about before. And they were able also to quantify certain hypotheses. So for example, this is for electricity consumption profile. Our domain experts had a hypothesis about the relationship between certain variables, but it was qualitative. And infograph dice allowed them to quantify this, to find the weights, basically. So yeah, if looking back, this evaluation allowed our participants, where we watched or observed that participants are able to explore different scenarios. And then this idea of thinking laterally, so domain experts were surprised by certain propositions of the system that they probably wouldn't have thought about otherwise. They wouldn't have combined dimensions like that if the system didn't propose certain things. So they were pleased about that one. And there was some sort of domain knowledge, of course. So we were able to observe for the wine fermentation use case that they had an interesting strategy to ferment wine, that they went to the lab and then tried to implement it. Of course, I don't know the results of this experiment, whether the wine was great or not. We have to see. But the evaluation of IVMS is really challenging. So, of course, we've done these evaluations. Our paper reviewers were very happy. We got the papers accepted. But we know that we cannot really validate the whole approach. We cannot validate the whole. We can validate certain aspects of those systems. And if you're interested in the problem of evaluating IVMLs, I suggest this reading. It's a paper that we wrote after a successful workshop on the evaluation of interactive visual machine learning system with many colleagues who have a lot of experience also developing IVMLs. So just to summarize, what are the main challenges that if you want to evaluate your system, IVML system, interactive visual machine learning system, we have maybe 4 that are really worth mentioning. So the first one is we need to be able to identify clear roles in this human-machine learning partnership. So IVML systems tend to be very complex. They're complex because we have complex data sets, we have often uncertain ground truth, we have a user interface that tend to be complex, we have visualizations, and we also have the human analysts with all the uncertainties that come with it. So it's very complex. And then there is also an interaction between the components. So I think there's a phenomena that is called co-adaptation, which I think Baptiste know about it. So the idea that the system proposes solutions to the user. So the user the system learns from the user exploration in our case. So the system adapts to user strategies. and goals, but at the same time, the user adapts to what is being proposed, so they could change the user strategy. So there is this phenomenon of co-adaptation between the system and the user. And if you look at the current evaluation, they tend to be one of two. They tend to be either considering the IVML as one whole system, but in this case, there's the problem of attribution. How do you attribute what results to what components? Or they could break down the system into different components, the algorithm, the machine, the learning component, the interface, the visualizations. But then we have the problem of how to isolate and study the different components in an effective manner. So maybe these are like, this is ongoing research, of course, so these are just pointers towards what the community is working on. So maybe, or would like to work on rather. So maybe the way forward is to try and work on methods to determine the contributions, the different types of contributions between the human and machine learning in the analysis. And maybe we need a taxonomy of different types of partnerships between the human and the machine. There is also probably interest in trying to decouple these IVML systems. Maybe we should design IVML systems that are easily separable, for example. The second evaluation challenge is with regards to the many trade-off considerations that we are faced with when we try to evaluate IVMLs. So I think Jules mentioned this idea of being personalized to the user, or the idea of speed of interaction as being criteria of success. But there are many of these criteria that exist, and depending on the context and your user task, this can change. And what's interesting is that often we see that these metrics are evaluated in isolation. I think with IVML, it's very important to consider this in conjunction, so especially that many of them are in conflict. And so moving on forward, I really like the idea that was proposed by Michael Sadelmayer, who is one of the co-authors of the paper I just showed you. And so thinking of evaluation as not just a single study, but a set of optimal studies along a Pareto front kind of setting. And so you had the dimension of the Pareto front being classical metrics like accuracy and complexity and interpretability, but you can also have new metrics like quality of insights that you get from the exploration, or user engagement, for example. So we can think then about a range of optimal IVML configurations, where we can then compare different variations of your system. It could be IVML, it could be the system with the learning components or the machine learning, and the system without it. So manual, automatic versus interactive. So different configurations and then comparing them. Then to add to the complication of the evaluation, there are many sources of uncertainty. So we know that machine learning predictions are probabilistic, and we know that analysts can be inconsistent and may give inappropriate or inaccurate feedback. So this is already known things. So moving forward, we know that it is difficult to get rid of the bias in human reasoning, but although there are strategies that we can put in place, but maybe we can do things like try and address class imbalance in training datasets before the evaluation. There is also a need to study how different types of uncertainty communications may impact trust in the model, and maybe how people give feedback to the ML. And finally, one big challenge is that we don't have guidelines. We don't have clear guidelines of how to evaluate IVMLs. And so designers might not be easily find the best way to evaluate IVMLs. And also how to explain the success or failure of and machine learning human collaboration. So moving on forward, we need to investigate reliability of new metrics. We hear a lot about trust, and I think this afternoon there will be a lot of talk about it, trust and confidence. Also the notion of appropriate trust. So when predictions of the machine learning are not accurate, what shall we do? One of the things that we can propose is the idea of a smooth handoff. So if the user is lacking in confidence in model predictions, maybe we should think about ways to do smooth handoff between the machine learning and the AI, and we can do the other way around as well. And maybe there are things we can learn from behavioral sciences to understand how people respond to information and learn from it. So there are other fields that actually study learning. Maybe you can learn from that. So just some concluding remarks. I've showed through a couple of IVML systems that we developed at INRAE that even with sparse data, machine learning, or between brackets, optimization, can be very useful. IVML systems that we used were designed for single user interaction, but in fact we also use them in collaborative contexts, even though they were not designed for collaboration. And we find really lots of benefit in using them in collaborative contexts. So, for example, in aligning expertise between different types of participants. So our evaluation was multifaceted. We did quantitative and qualitative, but it remains that lots of challenges in evaluating IBMLs. So thank you for listening, and I'm ready to take your questions in French or English. Yeah, and I should thank my collaborators, of course.
On va prendre peu de questions parce qu'on a fait un peu de retard et on prendra ce temps sur la pause déjeuner. On a 1h30 pour déjeuner, donc on prendra ce temps. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions dans la salle? Sinon, Baptiste.
Merci beaucoup. Une question sur for English.
Français aussi, ça marche.
Je voulais savoir un peu sur la question d'expertise mais des utilisateurs. Parce que du coup, j'imagine aussi dans toutes les évaluations, il y a ce côté expertise qui rentre en jeu et qui ne doit pas être si facile à analyser suivant les différentes cas d'études que tu as dans ta recherche. Et je voulais savoir un petit peu comment on prend en compte
l'expertise. Ça dépend les cas d'études. Donc, par exemple, quand on a évalué d'une façon quantitative avec les données synthétiques, là, on n'a pas eu à voir l'expertise. On a voulu juste voir des gens qui ont l'habitude de regarder les données, qui sont intéressés par l'analyse de données, par exemple, l'expérience avec Excel, mais pas plus. Mais dans les côtés qualitatifs, on a fait appel à des experts. C'était des experts dans les données, donc dans l'évaluation que j'ai montrée ici. Donc ils ont des connaissances sur leur domaine, biologie, agronomie, etc. Et on définit l'expertise par nombre d'années, par exemple, que vous avez travaillé sur ce type de données, et c'était subjectif comme évaluation. Par contre, j'ai d'autres travaux où on a remarqué la collaboration avec différents types d'expertise. Et là, c'est pas différents types dans l'expertise du domaine, du métier. C'est plutôt, on a vu vraiment le besoin de mettre en face les domain experts, les modélisateurs, les gens de l'optimisation et la visualisation dans le même endroit, parce que les experts du domaine ont l'habitude de regarder plutôt leurs données. C'est eux qui ont récolté leurs données. Or, dans ce que j'ai fait, j'ai montré, par exemple, dans la visualisation, une visualisation du modèle, une simulation. Donc, il y a une sorte d'adjustment à faire entre ce qu'ils savent de leurs données et ce que le modèle est en train de faire. Et en même temps, on avait les gens de l'optimisation qui vont pouvoir expliquer qu'est-ce que c'est, par exemple, un Pareto plant. Pourquoi je ne vois pas toutes mes données? Parce que c'est données optimisées. Donc, on a eu à réfléchir sur les différents types d'expertise et comment les annihiler, mais d'une façon pas systématique. C'était vraiment une étude observationnelle. Et je pense qu'il y a beaucoup de choses à creuser sur ce domaine.
Dans ce cas-là, c'était une collaboration entre ces différents experts.
Oui.
Qui étaient au même endroit.
Qui étaient au même endroit, autour d'une table interactive, en train d'explorer les données. Ouais. Et on a essayé de voir le type d'insight par rapport à l'expertise, etc. Et c'est d'une façon très qualitative.
Ok. On peut faire